All right, glory to Jesus Christ. Christ is in our midst. This is me live from the monastery. Well, I'm still kind of in the visitor status, so I'm not in the actual I mean, it's in the monastery, but there is part of it for guests and stuff, so I'm still here. Anyway, I wanted to make a very short video. Very short because I'm going to be using local Wi-Fi and I don't want to be using up all their traffic. But I guess I'm gonna speak about some Russian history, but you can figure out, I guess, where I'm heading with this, and I hope there won't be too many angry comments. But I'll try to mention my position as well related to the events of Russian history, and I hope then you can derive what my position on what I'm kind of referring to is. And I'm sorry for speaking in a low voice. The walls are pretty thin here, so I don't want to disturb anyone. So I got a new phone, so hopefully the microphone is pretty good on picking up even like lower speech. So anyway, so as you know, I'm a former old believer, and you probably know how the whole thing has started. Russia has preserved until the reforms of mid 17th century, the Byzantine rite that was practiced by the Byzantines before a certain period of time. It's kind of hard to say when exactly the rite has changed, but it's probably around 14th, 15th century, something like that. But essentially, after the fall of Constantinople, after the first, generation of patriarchs, Scholarius, and maybe one or two next ones, the communication between Russia and Constantinople kind of was cut, or not was it wasn't cut, but it was made much more difficult, and at the very least the hierarchs and the priests from Greece didn't come to Rus as much, or almost not at all, at a certain point. And so when in the Greek lands or post-Byzantine lands, there were no reforms. It was a natural evolution of the rite. Most famously, the sign of the cross was changed from this to this, and the blessing also from this to this. Singing of Alleluia 3 times instead of 2 times, and the changes, I've spoken about it enough times, I think. So anyhow, but that didn't happen in Rus, and so they continued to use the old Russian rite for quite a while. And then Nikon decided to kind of unify. For a lot of it was political reasons, or kind of messianic vision of Rus and the Tsar. And so he wanted to unify the rituals of the post-Byzantine lands with, not unify, but to correct Russian rites according to the rites that were practiced in Greece. Sorry. So obviously, the reforms were met pretty sharply because it was pretty sudden. It was not like they've been slowly preparing the people. People were living their normal life, and then first day of the Great Lent, Nikon announced the reforms, and of course people were furious. And you probably know the history of old ritualist or old believer movement, how people were burning themselves and all kinds of things. And at that time, there were not people who said, okay, we want to stay in union, but keep the old rites and stuff like that. So there was only a few figures. There was Ivan Neronov, who was originally a member of the old believer movement, but at the end of his life, he was basically the beginning of what was called Единоверие, or co-believers, or whatever you want to call them in English, meaning old believers in union, or old ritualists in union with Moscow Patriarchate, because at the end, closer to the end of his life, he was allowed to serve the old rites, but and remain kind of in good standing with the Russian Church. And ironically enough, Nikon also switched back to old rite once he was imprisoned on the island alone, and he was known to use the old books and to cross himself with two fingers, etc., etc. Obviously, when I was kind of beginning my church journey and I first inquired or got to know the whole history of this thing, I was still in OCA, and of course it felt like a great a horrible thing, and I still think it's a horrible and unfortunate thing. But the matter was basically this is what is important, staying in communion with what I thought or what people thought at that time to be the church, or it's more important to preserve the way of life. And obviously people usually treat this as it's their right to do something within the church. So Nikon had no right to change something, and they have all the right to keep the old ways. And closer to my end of my old believer journey, that was my position. So I didn't think of Niconians as heretics or even schismatics. I thought more of them as parasynagogue. But I thought that it was still the reason why I thought I was justified in remaining an old believer is because those were persecutions on the tradition, because saints crossed themselves with two fingers, Saint Sergius of Radonish and ancient saints, at least in early medieval times, crossed themselves with two fingers. Obviously, there's a whole deal that people used to cross themselves with one finger, but that's besides the point. There were many generations of people who crossed themselves like this, and as far as I was concerned, that was tradition. And so people had, at the very least, the right to preserve the tradition and not be persecuted for it. And so in that sense, Niconians separated from the old believers because they were the ones who were persecuting the tradition and not vice versa. And if you know, like, for example, the sitting on Solovetsky Island, basically all the monks were murdered brutally for being loyal to the old rites, but also, of course, they were physically fighting against the Tsar's army, so perhaps if they behaved in a different manner, they wouldn't be killed, but anyhow, it's not really justified the way what happened there, because people were really brutally killed and persecuted. But Later on, and this is part of the reason why I started thinking about Catholicism, is who says what tradition is and what the definition of tradition is. I'm not gonna argue and about this, and it's probably not a very good time for this, and I don't want to cause too many, arguments in the comment section. So, but essentially, the question is the church the guiding principle, or it's the decisions, um, and the church, I mean, in continuum. So it's not like I pick, say, because knowing what we know about old believers, the old rites of Russia are not the rites that were used in the early church, obviously. So is it up to me to choose, say, the rites that were practiced, let's say, between 12th century and 17th century, let's say, in Russia? Or is it the church that decides how and what to change? And if that is so, if the church that was created by Christ is the living tradition and not my personal preferences or choices, I cannot separate, no matter how essential rites, those rituals and rites were to my life, because it's not the rites and rituals, it's the church. And then you could say, well, they can make mistakes and all that stuff. Well, that's true. Practically speaking, they can make mistakes, and I think the reforms, at least the way Nikon performed them, was a travesty, and it's a horrible. It's a horrible way to go about it, and it caused a whole bunch of problems. And I'm not on kind of. I don't defend Nikon in any way, shape, or form, because I think he was a horrible patriarch and he caused a horrible thing in the Russian church. But nevertheless, not only did old believers essentially separated from the Russian church, but they also separated, in effect, from the rest of the church, the Greek church, the Bulgarian church, the Antiochian church, all the rest. So they all became schismatics to the old believers because they all switched to the new rite. And eventually, of course, as you know, the history went, there became priestless old believers and other radical groups, and even old believers with priests came to kind of certain shaky teachings and conclusions because of the way they ended up being. And so, essentially, aside from, of course, persecutions and all that, in the end, it's sad to say that all believers became more heretical, in a sense. Not heretical, but they acquired certain positions. Well, in case of priestless all believers, I would say heretical, but in majority of cases, I would say they became more wrong on a number of issues than Nikon. So on the one hand, you have Nikon and the persecutors, and on the one hand, you have teachings that are clearly wrong. But it all started with rituals. So obviously, I think Nikon is the one to blame. However, it's up to us, and it was up to the people to decide the course of action that they should have taken, and not necessarily to completely oppose Nikon. It was, even if they really wanted the old rites to come back, they needed to do it more strategically. And their direct opposition, I think, in a lot of ways fueled the counter reaction and the horrible kind of demagoguery that later generations kind of said and wrote about old believers. But I'll finish with the small example of Seraphim of Sarov. So if you know, Sarov was one of the centers of old ritualism, but it was hidden old ritualism. So they never opposed the church. And I guess whenever hierarchs would come, they would use the new rite, but they kept a lot of the old practices. I don't want to say they were old ritualists, because they were not, but they kept a lot of old practices. There was even an attack on Sarov before Seraphim in the first generation, and they were actually attacked by the Tsar militia because of the because they were said to be, practicing schism, which is, old ritualism. But nevertheless, they remained faithful to the church even after that. And Seraphim of Sarov, as you know, was wearing a half cape that the old believers wear, and he had liestovka, which is the prayer rope kind of that the old believers used, and the clothing was kind of old ritualist-ish. And even at his time, they were known to practice some old ritualist things from time to time. But anyway, these type of people kind of remained loyal and followed, more or less at least, what the church authorities told them to do. And then eventually this came to the creation of Единоверие, and now, as you know, the old right parishes in Russia are kind of living their life. And so yeah, my point is, and I'll finish with this, is that sometimes the reaction, which is maybe righteous in a way, makes things worse, because it actually confirms what the church authorities do, even when they don't do a correct thing, practically speaking, at least. Whether or not they should have reformed the Russian old rites, that's another topic. And I think they did. They did need to do it, but in a different way and in a different manner, and both content-wise and practically, and in terms of, the way they went about it. But the direct confrontation caused more damage than if the people followed what the church fathers and desert fathers say about being loyal and listening to your authority. That sometimes, even if you're asked to do something that you are not fully in agreement with, you still do it. And eventually the way you behave will do more than if you would have tried to oppose it and go against it directly. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. I have more thoughts, but monks should not speak as much, although I'm not a monk yet, but I think 20 minutes is enough. And hopefully this kind of tells you thank you for the prayers and for everything. I'm sure that your prayers helped, because when I was flying here, most of the flights to Lviv were canceled actually, and flew somewhere else because there was a lot of fog here. But I was on the plane, the only plane out of several planes that landed here from Turkey, and I got through with no problems, even though people told me, there are a lot of problems at the border, so there were none. So I'm sure that God did this through your prayers among others. All right, God bless, and Merry Christmas to Latin Rite Catholics, and well, if you're still on Julian for some strange reason, I mean, in the West, then, uh, Happy New Year, I guess, coming New Year, and well, have a blessed Christmas when it comes. All right, God bless.